Welcome, dear listener, to a peaceful journey into the depths of the human spirit. As the day gently fades and the quiet of evening descends, allow your mind to unwind, your breath to soften, and your thoughts to settle. Tonight we'll explore the extraordinary life of Carl Jung, a man who, with quiet courage, ventured into the uncharted territories of his own soul, bringing back a profound map for all of us. He once wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." These gentle words, born from deep personal exploration, invite us to consider the quiet power of our inner worlds. Before we begin our story, a quick, soft note. Playing a few brief advertisements helps us continue to bring you these soothing narratives each week. We've placed them only at the very beginning, so after these few moments, the rest of our journey together will flow uninterrupted, guiding you gently toward rest. If you find peace in these stories, a quiet like and subscribe helps other restless minds discover them too. And if there's a particular figure you'd like to hear about next, feel free to whisper their name in the comments below. Now let us begin our calming exploration into the life of Carl Jung. Perhaps you've had a recurring dream you couldn't quite explain, or felt drawn to patterns in your life you don't fully understand. Carl Jung's journey suggests that the answers lie within, in a place we are sometimes taught to avoid our own inner depths. Tonight we'll recount his life, understanding the gentle map he offered for navigating our own souls. By the end, you may find that his quiet descent into the heart of consciousness and his eventual return holds keys to understanding your own profound inner world. This is the bedtime biography of Carl Jung. Chapter 1. The Swiss Soil. Carl Gustav Jung was born in Switzerland on a summer's day, July 26th, in 1875. This tranquil country, with its deep valleys and soaring peaks, would subtly shape everything he became. To truly understand Jung, one must first feel the essence of his homeland. Switzerland was, as one writer called it, a national park of the spirit, a place where citizens often engaged directly in their governance, where a sense of individual responsibility ran deeper than in many other nations. This was a country rooted in the quiet, enduring peasant soil, where the steady rhythms of instinct and nature often held more weight than purely urban concerns. For over 400 years, Switzerland had turned gently inward, choosing internal political reflections over external wars. This meant that Jung grew up without the common psychological habit of seeing evils only in neighboring countries. Instead, the Swiss often looked inward for conflict, a national trait that would become the very foundation of Jung's entire approach to the human psyche. He would later call this profound inner work the confrontation with the shadow. Jung was fiercely Swiss, a quality that kept him grounded even as his mind ventured into truly disorienting inner territories. The practical, earthy nature of Swiss life acted as an anchor, preventing him from being swept away by the powerful currents of his internal explorations. He was a product of this soil, practical yet profoundly inward-looking. His childhood unfolded in the quiet riverside town of Keswil, and later in Klein-Honingen, near Basel. There, ancient Roman ruins crumbled softly by the Rhine, and vineyards stretched out, sleepy and green, beneath the warm summer sun. Yet, beneath this pastoral surface, the young boy experienced inner events that would leave an indelible mark on his soul. Between the ages of 3 and 4, Jung had a dream that would resonate with him throughout his entire life. He descended slow, ancient stone steps deep into the earth. There, in an underground chamber, he encountered a sight that deeply stirred him, a giant flesh-colored form resting on a golden throne. His mother's gentle voice in the dream called it the man-eater. This powerful dream quietly initiated him into what he would later call the secrets of the earth. It was the tranquil beginning of his intellectual life, a subtle preview of the creative force that would guide him. By age 11, Jung began to feel a gentle split within himself. There was personality number 1, the ordinary schoolboy, who sometimes struggled with mathematics and occasionally disappointed his teachers. Then there was personality number 2, a wise, timeless presence who seemed to have lived centuries before, in the quiet elegance of the 18th century. This wasn't a sign of madness, but rather his first intuitive awareness of the delicate relationship between the conscious ego and something far larger, something eternal, living quietly within. Around this time, another profound vision came to him. Sitting peacefully outside Basel Cathedral on a bright day, he wrestled with a thought trying to break through his conscious mind. For days he gently resisted it. Finally he surrendered. He saw God on his throne above the cathedral, and then, in a moment of startling clarity, God dropped an enormous object that shattered his own church. Yet, instead of damnation, Jung felt an unutterable bliss. He understood something profoundly true, that the divine refused to be bound by human tradition. God, in his vastness, embraced both creation and destruction. These quiet, profound secrets made him feel profoundly alone. He couldn't share them with anyone, not his pastor father, who preached with a visible lack of conviction, not his mother, who had her own strange moments of otherworldly absence, not his schoolmates, who seemed to live in a different universe entirely. This inner isolation would become both a gentle burden and a quiet strength, compelling him to cultivate an inner life of extraordinary depth. The Swiss soil had indeed produced something unusual in Carl Jung, a boy who thought in images rather than words, who experienced the divine as something wild and contradictory, and who felt himself deeply connected to something ancient running beneath the orderly surface of Swiss life. This tranquil foundation would support everything that came after: his gentle divergence from Freud, his deep descent into the unconscious, and his quiet discovery of the collective patterns that shape all human experience. Chapter 2: Two Personalities and a Quiet Awakening. The gentle split in Jung's nature became more pronounced as he grew. Personality number 1 continued to attend school, attempting to fit in and still finding mathematics a challenge. This was the boy who sometimes got into playground skirmishes, who occasionally disappointed his teachers, and who seemed destined for an ordinary life. But personality number 2 lived in another realm entirely. This was the ancient one, the quiet observer who knew things without consciously learning them, who felt connected to the steadfast stones, the enduring mountains, and the centuries that had long passed. School at times felt like a quiet struggle, not because Jung lacked intelligence, but because he found it difficult to reconcile these two distinct worlds within him. During a geometry lesson, his teacher accused him of cheating on a paper. Jung hadn't cheated, but he couldn't prove it. The subtle sting of injustice resonated deep within. More than that, it confirmed his growing sense that the outer world of rigid rules and logical proofs had little to do with the deeper, more profound truth living quietly inside him. At 12, something shifted gently. A classmate playfully shoved him, and Jung's head softly struck the pavement. He lay there for a moment longer than necessary, a quiet thought flashing through his mind: now you won't have to go to school. For 6 months thereafter, he experienced fainting spells whenever the prospect of school approached. His parents grew softly desperate. Doctors found nothing physically wrong. Jung quietly overheard his father telling a friend his fear of what would become of his son, having no money to support him if he remained incurable. These words resonated deeply, like cold water on his soul. He forced himself back to his father's study, opened a Latin grammar, and immediately felt the familiar faintness approaching. He fought it with every ounce of his inner will. After a quiet hour, The faintness retreated. He never fainted again. This was his first conscious victory over his own psyche, his first gentle understanding that the mind could create illness, and through quiet will overcome it. Yet, the profound secret remained. That quiet vision of God, gently reordering his own cathedral, continued to resonate within Jung. He searched his father's theological books for answers, but found nothing but what felt like dry, unmoving formulas. His father preached every Sunday about God's love and grace, but Jung saw the quiet doubt in his eyes. Carl Jung, his father, no longer seemed to believe his own sermons. He was trapped in a faith that had lost its living, vibrant core. Confirmation classes arrived. Jung held a quiet hope for revelation, for someone to explain the gentle mystery of communion. Instead, he encountered more empty ritual. When he took his first communion, he felt nothing, absolutely nothing. The other boys seemed transported, but Jung sat there, the wafer dissolving softly on his tongue, thinking, "This is all dead." The church, he realized, had quietly failed him. These experiences drove Jung deeper into himself. He read voraciously Goethe's Faust, Schopenhauer, Kant. He discovered that others had felt this gentle split between outer conformity and inner truth. He wasn't insane. He was simply seeing what others gently refused to see. The world operated on two subtle levels. Most people lived only on the surface, but underneath, in the quiet depths, moved forces that the churches and schools never mentioned. Forces that could gently reorder cathedrals, heal fainting boys, and speak through dreams of underground chambers. Chapter 3. The Call to Psychiatry. Jung entered Basel University in 1895, a young man of 19, still quietly uncertain of his ultimate path. Medicine seemed practical, a grounded choice. His family had no money for anything impractical, but underneath, a deeper current gently flowed. He yearned to understand the strange experiences that had marked his childhood. He wanted to know why minds could seemingly split, why God appeared in dreams, why fainting spells could be cured by will alone. His father died in 1896. Carl Jung, having lost his faith years before, now quietly lost his life. The family was left with almost nothing. At 20, Jung became quietly responsible for his mother and sister. His uncle told him gently but bluntly that this was how one learns to be a man. Jung sold antiques on commission, worked as an assistant, and often ate just one meal a day when money grew thin. Then came incidents that defied easy explanation. Jung sat studying quietly with his mother in the dining room. A sound like a pistol shot rang out. The solid walnut table, 70 years old and sturdy, had split straight across its entire length. There had been no change in temperature, no visible tension in the wood, just an impossible sudden crack running through solid timber. 2 weeks later, another soft explosion. In the sideboard, a steel bread knife had shattered into 4 pieces. The blade lay broken in the drawer, surrounded by undisturbed linens. These events gently pulled Jung toward the occult, not as a believer, but as a curious investigator. His relatives held seances with a young cousin, who claimed to channel spirits. Jung attended with a notebook, quietly recording everything. The girls spoke in different voices, claimed past lives, and described the architecture of the spirit world. Most of it was clearly fantasy, but occasionally something genuine seemed to break through, some knowledge she couldn't possibly have, some subtle change in her face that went beyond mere acting. Medical school continued its gentle rhythm. Surgery, internal medicine, pathology. Jung felt no true calling to any of it. On the eve of his final exams, still quietly undecided on a specialty, He picked up a psychiatric textbook by Krafft Ebing. The preface softly stated that psychiatric textbooks always reflected the subjective views of their authors more than other medical texts, that psychiatry was the stepchild of medicine, working in the dark with little respect from other doctors. A gentle lightning struck within him. This was it. Psychiatry was where natural science softly met the spiritual world, where doctors wrestled with the same subtle forces that had split his table and shattered his knife, where the human soul revealed itself in all its terrible, quiet complexity. His friends were quietly horrified. Psychiatry, they whispered, was professional suicide. The asylums were seen as dumping grounds. The patients, hopeless. Jung didn't care. He had found his quiet calling. In 1900 he took a position at the Berg Holzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. He stood before the locked doors, 24 years old, carrying everything he owned in a single suitcase. Behind those doors waited the mad, the broken, the ones who lived in the same split world he had known since childhood. He was, in a profound and gentle sense, coming home. Chapter 4. Berg Holzli and the Unconscious. The Berg Holzli Psychiatric Hospital stood peacefully on Zollikerberg Hill, overlooking the serene city of Zurich. When Jung arrived in December 1900, a soft blanket of snow covered the grounds. The building itself was modern and progressive, under Eugen Bleuler's quiet, innovative direction. It had become one of Europe's leading psychiatric institutions. Bleuler believed in gently understanding patients, not just restraining them. This radical, compassionate approach immediately attracted Jung. Jung felt a quiet sense of overwhelm. He later wrote that he understood nothing at all. His medical training at Basel hadn't quite prepared him for this profound encounter. He moved into the hospital, living among the patients and staff. For 6 months, he read obsessively, 50 volumes of the Allgemeine Zeitschrift for Psychiatry, every case history he could find. He needed to understand what madness actually was, beyond the simple classifications and Latin names. The patients themselves, in their quiet ways, taught him more than any textbook ever could. There was Babette, an old woman who had spent decades in the hospital. She spoke in strange word salads that other doctors simply dismissed as meaningless. Jung listened differently, with a gentle, discerning ear. He began to notice subtle patterns. When she said she was the Lorelei, or that Naples and I must supply the world with noodles, Jung heard something deeper beneath the surface. These weren't random firings of a broken brain. They were symbolic communications from a psyche that had quietly retreated into its own rich mythological world. The association experiment changed everything. Jung and Franz Ricklin modified the existing test. They paid quiet attention to what others ignored. When Jung said mother, and a patient took 12 seconds to respond with kind, that gentle delay held deep meaning. The complex had been touched. Something emotional, unresolved, was softly interfering with the simple task of word association. They could measure the unconscious. They could gently prove its existence. Jung tested the method on himself and his colleagues. Everyone had complexes. The difference between the normal and the pathological wasn't the existence of complexes, but their intensity. A normal person might hesitate slightly at certain words. A neurotic might be thrown into gentle confusion. A psychotic might be completely overwhelmed. The complexes in psychotics had become autonomous. They lived their own quiet lives, creating voices and visions. One case gently haunted Jung. A woman named Sabina Spielrein arrived in 1904, screaming and fighting. She was brilliant, multilingual, but tormented by sexual and aggressive fantasies. Jung spent hours with her, not analyzing from a distant, objective stance, but gently engaging with her inner world. she improved dramatically. Later, she would become a psychoanalyst herself, but the intensity of their relationship, the way her complexes quietly resonated with his own, showed Jung how profoundly delicate and demanding this work could be. The doctor, he realized, could be subtly affected by the patient's inner world, or perhaps, in the process, discover his own. It was this profound work that gently led Jung to Freud. The interpretation of dreams confirmed what Jung was quietly finding. The unconscious had its own deep logic. Dreams weren't meaningless, but were compensatory, gently balancing conscious attitudes. When Jung read Freud's work, he felt less alone. Here was another quiet explorer of these dark, uncharted territories. In 1906, Jung sent Freud his studies in word association. Freud responded enthusiastically. Their correspondence began, but even then, Jung harbored quiet reservations. Freud seemed to reduce everything to sexuality and childhood trauma. Jung, however, saw patients whose delusions contained mythological themes they'd never studied. The schizophrenic man described visions that matched ancient mythic liturgies. How could purely personal sexual trauma explain that? Jung began quietly collecting these parallels. The psychotic patients at Bergholzli weren't just sick. They were, in a profound sense, gently drowning in the same mythological material that mystics and visionaries had experienced throughout history. Emma quietly re-entered his life during this period. Having first met her and felt an instant conviction they would marry while he was still a student, their relationship deepened, and they married in 1903. She came from wealth, the Rauschenbach industrial fortune. This gently freed Jung from financial worry, but created other subtle tensions. Emma had to accept that her husband would disappear into his study for days, that he might suddenly announce they were conducting seances in the house, that patients might live with them for months. She began studying mathematics and Latin, and later psychology, quietly trying to enter his profound world. By 1905, Jung was a senior physician. He had his own wards, his own assistants. He introduced work therapy, having patients gently engage in meaningful tasks rather than sitting idle. He noticed that paranoid patients often improved when given responsibility. The therapeutic community itself, he realized, could quietly heal. But Jung grew restless. The hospital routine, though supportive, subtly constrained him. He needed freedom to pursue the larger, more profound patterns he was seeing, the mythological dimensions of madness, the collective layers beneath individual neurosis. His reputation spread. American doctors visited to learn the association method. Jung gave lectures, wrote papers, but inside he felt a growing, gentle split. The medical model explained too little. Diagnosis and classification missed the deeper meaning of madness. Each patient was living out a quiet story, a myth that connected to something far beyond personal history. In 1909, after 9 transformative years, Jung quietly resigned from Bergholzli. He had learned what institutional psychiatry could teach. Now he needed to venture into territories no hospital could contain. Chapter 5. The Gentle Break with Freud. The house in Kuznach gently rose from Jung's own vision, 3 stories of stone and timber on the tranquil shore of Lake Zurich. He designed it himself. Beginning in 1908, every room thoughtfully planned for his growing family and his profound work. Emma was pregnant with their 4th child. The place had consulting rooms, a library and quiet spaces for the patients who sometimes lived with them. Moving there in 1909 marked Jung's quiet independence from institutional psychiatry. But another gentle break was approaching. That same year, Jung sailed to America with Freud and Sandor Ferenczi. Clark University had invited them to lecture. During the 7-week journey, They analyzed each other's dreams daily. It was intimate, intense, but subtle cracks began to appear. Freud quietly refused to share certain dreams, saying he couldn't risk his authority. Jung was gently stunned. This wasn't scientific collaboration. This felt like a father gently demanding obedience from his sons. Jung's house dream came during the voyage. He found himself in a house he somehow knew was his own. The upper floor was decorated in Rococo style, elegant but somewhat superficial. Descending stairs, he discovered a ground floor from medieval times, stone walls, ancient furniture, a heavy door leading to more stone steps going down. The cellar was Roman with brick walls and a dusty floor. On the floor, a quiet ring. He pulled it. More stairs descended into a cave cut from solid rock. Scattered on the floor were pottery shards, bones, and 2 human skulls, very old and half disintegrated. Freud gently pressed for an interpretation. What did the skulls represent? Jung knew what Freud wanted: death wishes towards someone close. That's what Freudian theory gently demanded. Jung mentioned his wife and sister-in-law. Freud was satisfied, but Jung knew he'd subtly betrayed his own deeper understanding. The dream wasn't about personal death wishes. It was a profound image of the psyche itself. Consciousness on top, then the personal unconscious, then deeper layers containing the ancient history of humanity itself, a collective unconscious. Back in Europe, Jung gently threw himself into mythology. He read everything: Greek myths, Germanic legends, Egyptian mysteries. The same profound patterns appeared everywhere. The hero's journey, the great mother, the wise old man, the shadow. These weren't transmitted through culture alone. Psychotic patients who'd never studied mythology spontaneously produced the same symbols. A factory worker drew mandalas identical to Tibetan designs he'd never seen. In 1910, Jung was elected president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Freud had gently pushed for this, wanting his Gentile crown prince to make psychoanalysis respectable. But at the same Congress, cracks quietly widened. Freud demanded absolute loyalty to the sexual theory. He called it their dogma, their unshakable bulwark against occultism. Jung felt a quiet sickness. Science, he knew, didn't have dogmas. Religions did. Jung started writing Symbols of Transformation in 1911. He gently analyzed the fantasies of a young American woman he'd never met, showing how her visions paralleled ancient myths. The libido, he argued, wasn't just sexual energy but psychic energy that could take many forms. The psyche had its own quiet purposes beyond personal pleasure or trauma. Every page moved further from Freud. He knew what this book would gently cost him. His entire professional circle was Freudian. Publishing it meant isolation. Emma gently begged him to reconsider. For months, Jung couldn't write the final chapter. Then he gently forced himself. Better to lose everything than betray his own profound understanding. The book appeared in 1912. Freud's response was swift and brutal. Jung, he declared, was a mystic, a traitor, mentally disturbed. Their final meeting came at a Munich conference in November 1912. They were discussing the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep. Freud insisted the pharaoh had erased his father's name from monuments out of hatred. Jung gently disagreed. It was about religious differences, he argued, not a personal father complex. Freud grew agitated. Suddenly he fell from his chair in a dead faint. Jung caught him, carried him to a couch. When Freud's eyes opened, he looked at Jung with undisguised fury. Their correspondence gently deteriorated. Freud wrote that Jung's ideas came from neurosis. Jung softly shot back that Freud reduced all disagreement to pathology, treating colleagues like patients. By January 1913, Jung quietly resigned his presidency. By April, the personal relationship was gently broken. Jung was 37 professionally. It seemed destroyed, friendless in his field. But something else was happening. Without Freud's framework to contain them, Jung's own unconscious contents began gently erupting. Visions of floods of blood covering Europe, cities of the dead, catastrophe approaching. He thought he was slowly going psychotic. He didn't know these were premonitions of the World War that would begin in 1914. He only knew that having lost his outer supports, he was gently falling into an inner abyss. The real profound work was about to begin. Chapter 6. Confrontation with the Unconscious. The years immediately following his gentle break with Freud were, in their own way, the most profoundly introspective of Jung's life. He felt the ground softly disappearing beneath him. Strange, subtle moods came, a quiet pressure in his skull, dreams of corpses, of blood-soaked lands. In October 1913, traveling alone, he had a vision. A monstrous flood seemed to cover Europe. The Alps rose higher, as if to protect Switzerland. Yellow waves carried floating bodies. Then the water turned to blood. The vision returned 2 weeks later. A quiet voice suggested it would become real. Jung worried he was developing schizophrenia. He knew the subtle signs from Bergholzli, the mythological visions, the quiet voices, the sense of prophetic mission. He considered stopping his practice. How could he gently treat patients when he felt his own mind teetering on a subtle edge? Then, August 1914 arrived. World War I began. The blood covering Europe was indeed real blood. Jung understood that the visions weren't personal psychosis. They were gentle eruptions from the collective unconscious, premonitions of a collective disaster. This gave him quiet courage for what he had to do next. He decided to softly drop all defenses and allow the unconscious to come forth. This for him was scientific exploration, not a surrender to madness. On December 12, 1913, he sat at his desk and deliberately, yet gently, let go. He fell through darkness. Then his feet softly hit ground. He was in a cave. An old man with a white beard stood beside a beautiful young woman. The man introduced himself as Elijah. The woman was Salome. They had a quiet companion, a large black serpent. Jung learned to enter these visions consciously. He called it active imagination. He wasn't just observing fantasies. He was gently participating, asking questions, quietly demanding answers. The figures had their own personalities, their own profound knowledge. Philemon, an old man with kingfisher wings, appeared. He taught Jung about the reality of the psyche itself. Thoughts, he learned, weren't things you simply made. They were things that gently happened to you. Every evening, Jung descended into these visions. He wrote everything in journals, painted the images. The material was gently overwhelming. Mythological figures, geometric patterns, scenes of ritual and transformation. He had to develop techniques to stay quietly grounded. He continued to see patients. He carved stone. He sailed his boat on the lake. His family became his gentle anchor to consensus reality. Emma watched her husband quietly disappear into his study each night. She heard him talking to invisible presences. She could have had him committed. Instead, with quiet strength, she held the household together. She raised their 5 children while Jung wrestled with forces that might have destroyed another man. Later, she would become an analyst herself, understanding from inside what those profound years had gently cost. The most quietly humbling moment came when inner voices gently commanded him to play. A grown man, a doctor, building little cities with stones on the lake shore. But Jung obeyed. As he built, memories gently surfaced, childhood games, forgotten dreams. The play reconnected him to the creative force that exists before rational thought. This, he realized, was individuation, the process of becoming quietly whole, not rising above the primitive, but gently integrating it. Chapter 7. The Frontiers Open, and the Tower. After the war ended in 1918, Jung slowly emerged from his deep descent, profoundly changed. The visions continued, but less urgently. He felt a quiet need to give them form. In 1923, he bought land in Bollingen on the upper lake of Zurich. Remote, quiet, accessible only by foot or boat, he would build something there with his own hands. The tower began as a simple, round structure. Jung laid every stone himself. No electricity, no running water, cooking over fire, drawing water from the lake. He carved inscriptions in Latin and images from his visions. This wasn't regression. It was a deep connection to something essential. Here he could be personality number 2, completely, the timeless man who existed quietly outside modern time. Word of Jung's work gently spread. English and American students arrived. They weren't looking for Freudian analysis. They wanted what Jung offered, a psychology that quietly included the spiritual dimension. Among them came wealthy Americans who would gently fund his projects. Edith Rockefeller McCormick, daughter of John D. Rockefeller, moved to Zurich specifically to work with Jung. In 1916, Jung founded the Psychological Club in Zurich, not for group therapy, which he gently disdained, but to give his patients a sense of community. Individual analysis could sometimes isolate people. They needed others who quietly understood the process. The club became a strange, gentle mixing ground. Swiss burghers, American heiresses, English intellectuals, all united by their profound confrontation with the unconscious. Jung insisted that you cannot individuate on Mount Everest. The process required gentle engagement with ordinary life, marriage, work, social responsibilities. These weren't distractions from spiritual development. They were the very testing ground. Anyone could have visions in isolation. The real, quiet work was integrating those visions while maintaining relationships, earning money, raising children. The tower grew over the years. Jung added sections as his psyche developed. A second tower in 1927 after his mother died, a hall in 1935, an upper story in 1945 after Emma's death. Each addition marked an inner transformation made concrete in stone. Visitors often found it subtly unsettling. Time moved differently there. Jung might spend weeks alone, cooking simple meals, carving stone, living a rhythm unchanged since medieval times. His practice in Küsnacht flourished. Patients came from around the world, but Jung was selective. He wouldn't treat anyone who wasn't truly serious about inner work. He might prescribe unusual, gentle tasks. Paint your dreams, dance your feelings, talk to your symptoms. One woman who complained of stomach problems was told to let her stomach speak. It had plenty to say about what she'd been quietly swallowing in her marriage. The work was profoundly delicate. Some patients couldn't handle what gently emerged. A few, sadly, ended in psychiatric hospitals. Jung never minimized these quiet risks. The unconscious contained both creative and destructive forces. Opening to it meant gently accepting both. This wasn't mere self-improvement. It was transformation. And transformation, he understood, always involved the gentle death of the old personality. Not everyone he knew survived intact. Chapter 8. Journeys into Other Worlds. Jung felt a quiet need to view the European psyche from an external perspective. In 1925, he traveled to New Mexico to visit the Pueblo Indians. On the train west, he watched the landscape softly change from bustling cities to vast desert. America, he sensed, struck him as a place racing forward without ever looking back. Whites, he felt, had severed their deep roots, living entirely in consciousness, in their heads. At Taos Pueblo, Jung met an elder named Oe Biano, or Mountain Lake. They sat quietly on the roof of his adobe house. Mountain Lake studied Jung's face. He said whites were mad, their eyes showing it, always staring, always wanting something. They thought with their heads, while the Pueblo, he explained, thought with their hearts. Jung gently asked him about their religious practices. Mountain Lake grew careful. These were secrets whites had tried to destroy for centuries. Finally, Mountain Lake softly explained that his people helped their father, the sun, cross the sky each day. Without their prayers and rituals, the sun, they believed, would stop rising. Darkness would swallow the world. Jung sat stunned. Here was a people whose daily life held cosmic significance. Every morning ritual, they believed, affected the entire universe. No wonder whites seemed mad to them. Whites had no such unifying meaning. That same year, Jung sailed to East Africa. He wanted to quietly observe consciousness at its dawn. The Athi plains stretched endlessly, covered with vast herds, zebras, antelopes, gazelles, moving like a single organism. Jung felt he'd stepped back millions of years. This was the world before human consciousness gently separated itself from nature. Standing on a hill at sunrise, watching the herds move below, Jung had a revelation. The animals were complete in themselves. They needed nothing from human observation. But human consciousness, he realized, gave them objective existence. Without a conscious observer, the world existed, but had no meaning. Man, he understood, was indispensable for completing creation. Through human awareness, the universe became quietly conscious of itself. He traveled up the Nile to Egypt. At the tomb of Ramses, something subtle yet profound happened. The guide lit a match to illuminate hieroglyphs. In that brief, fleeting flare, Jung saw the whole history of Egypt compressed into a moment. The rise and fall of dynasties, the birth and death of gods. Time seemed to collapse. He understood how the Egyptian soul experienced eternity, how the dead remained profoundly present for them. But Africa also showed Jung something quietly troubling. In Kenya, he watched his English companions slowly unravel. One began drinking heavily. Another grew paranoid. The continent's psychic atmosphere was subtly affecting them. They were losing their European personas, becoming what they imagined primitives to be. Jung realized colonialism created a dangerous psychological situation. Whites projected their unconscious onto the colonized, then either idealized or demonized what they saw. These journeys gently changed Jung's understanding of analysis. Every culture, he realized, had its own unique psychological orientation. What healed a European might subtly disturb an African. What made sense to an American might be meaningless to an Indian. The psyche was both universal and culturally specific. The archetypes were the same everywhere, but their expressions varied radically. Analysis, he knew, had to account for this. A psychology that claimed universal validity while ignoring cultural difference was in its own way another form of colonialism. Chapter 9. Back to Europe and alchemy. Jung returned to Europe in 1926 with a dream that softly lingered. He stood in Liverpool, a city he'd never visited. Rain fell steadily. The streets were dark, arranged like spokes of a wheel. At the very center grew a magnolia tree, in full bloom, softly lit by sunlight that seemed to come from nowhere. The tree glowed in the darkness. Its roots reached deep into black earth, while its flowers opened to an invisible sun. Liverpool, he realized, meant pool of life. The dream showed him the self, the radiant center of psychic totality. No matter how dark the surroundings, this center contained its own gentle light. The image was a mandala, the Sanskrit word for magic circle. Jung had been quietly drawing these circular patterns for years without knowing their ancient history. Now he understood they appeared spontaneously when the psyche sought wholeness. In 1928, confirmation came from an unexpected source. Richard Wilhelm, the German sinologist, sent Jung a translation of an ancient Chinese text, The Secret of the Golden Flower. Jung opened it and felt his isolation softly shatter. Here were his own discoveries, described in thousand-year-old Taoist language. The golden flower was consciousness. The circular movement was individuation. Ancient Chinese sages had mapped the same profound territory Jung was exploring. Wilhelm's text mentioned Western parallels in alchemy. Jung had dismissed alchemy as primitive chemistry. Now he looked again. He found an old book, Artis Aurifera, and began reading. The alchemists weren't trying to make physical gold. They were projecting psychological processes onto matter. When they described mercury becoming gold, they were really describing the transformation of consciousness. Jung gently threw himself into collecting alchemical texts, Latin manuscripts, Greek fragments, Arabic treatises. The language was deliberately obscure. Alchemists had hidden their real work behind chemical metaphors to avoid persecution by the church. They spoke of marriage, of sun and moon, death of the king, birth of the divine child, all symbols Jung had encountered in his patient's dreams and his own visions. The discovery changed everything. Jung now had historical precedent for his psychology. The alchemists were his predecessors, working with the same material through different methods. They had created a quiet bridge between Gnosticism and modern psychology. Where the Gnostics had been suppressed by Orthodox Christianity, the alchemists had survived by disguising their spiritual work as chemistry. One image particularly struck Jung. The alchemists drew the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail. They said this represented the prima materia, the first matter that contained everything needed for transformation. Jung recognized this as the unconscious itself. It consumed and renewed itself endlessly. The work of individuation, he realized, was learning to gently relate to this circular process without being devoured by it. Emma quietly joined him in studying alchemy. She specialized in the Grail legends, seeing them as another hidden tradition of individuation. Together they decoded centuries of symbolic texts. The work gave their marriage new depth. They were no longer just husband and wife, but fellow investigators of the Western soul's secret history. Chapter 10. The Shadow of the Reich. Jung watched the rise of National Socialism with growing alarm. By 1933, he saw what he called a mass psychosis quietly boiling up in Germany. The careful, rational surface of German culture was gently cracking. Underneath, something ancient and terrible was stirring. Jung recognized it as Wotan, the old Germanic god of storm and frenzy, the wanderer who possessed men and drove them to ecstasy or destruction. He wrote about this in an essay that would gently haunt him forever. Wotan had awakened in the German unconscious. The god had been dormant since the conversion to Christianity, but never truly died. Now he was possessing an entire nation. The torch parades, the mass rallies, the hypnotic speeches. These were Wotan's rituals. Hitler was less a man than a medium, channeling forces he didn't fully understand. In 1933, Jung made a decision he would later quietly regret. He accepted the presidency of the General Medical Society for Psychotherapy. The society was based in Germany, now under Nazi control. Jung thought he could gently protect his Jewish colleagues. He changed the statutes, so Jewish doctors expelled from the German section could join as individual members of the international body. He kept correspondence showing he fought to maintain Jewish membership, but the damage was done. Jung had lent his name to an organization in Nazi Germany. His enemies would use this against him forever. calling him a Nazi sympathizer. The truth was more complex. Jung despised totalitarianism. He saw Nazism and communism as twin evils, both crushing individual consciousness beneath collective possession. His entire psychology was about strengthening the individual against mass-mindedness. He treated several Germans who came to him in secret during these years. They described their quiet horror at what was happening. Decent people were becoming monsters. Neighbors denounced neighbors, children informed on parents. Jung saw this as shadow projection on a massive scale. Germans were projecting all their inferior qualities onto Jews, then trying to exterminate what they couldn't face in themselves. The situation grew worse. Jewish analysts fled to England and America. Jung helped where he could, writing recommendations, arranging positions, but he also made statements about psychological differences between Jews and Germans that would be subtly twisted out of context. He was trying to argue that every group had its own psychological character shaped by history, but in that political climate, any mention of difference was weaponized. By 1936, Jung saw war coming. His patients reported apocalyptic dreams, images of fire, destruction, armies of the dead. The collective unconscious was quietly preparing for catastrophe. Jung resigned from the German society in 1940. His name appeared on a Nazi blacklist. When France fell, Swiss authorities told him to leave Zurich. He might be kidnapped or assassinated. Jung stayed. He was Swiss. He would not abandon his country or his patients. But he knew what was coming. The shadow that Europe had refused to face was about to gently engulf the continent. All the darkness that civilized nations projected onto primitives was erupting in the heart of civilization itself. The most cultured nation in Europe was committing the most barbarous acts in history. Chapter 11. India and the Self. Jung sailed for India in late 1937. He went not as a seeker of Eastern wisdom, but as a psychologist needing to gently understand a radically different approach to consciousness. India had developed sophisticated methods of inner exploration for thousands of years. Jung wanted to experience these firsthand, to test his own discoveries against an ancient, profound tradition. The Taj Mahal struck him first. Standing before it at dawn, he saw it as a monument to Eros, to the principle of relationship. The Muslim ruler who built it understood something Christianity had quietly forgotten. Love could be a path to the divine. The structure itself was a mandala, perfect symmetry, expressing the union of masculine and feminine. Islam, Jung realized, had preserved the emotional warmth that Protestant Christianity had subtly banished. At the stupa of Sanchi, Jung encountered something else entirely. The ancient Buddhist monument rose from the hill like a thought-made stone. Here was the opposite of the Taj Mahal, no celebration of relationship, but the solitary path to enlightenment. The Buddha had abandoned wife and child to find truth. He had dissolved all attachments to reach nirvana. Jung felt the austere power of this path, and its complete foreignness to Western psychology. In Calcutta, Jung fell gently ill with dysentery. For 10 days he lay in his hotel, fevered and delirious. During this illness he had a crucial dream. He stood on an island off the English coast. Before him lay the Holy Grail, radiating light. A quiet voice said, this was the healing vessel Europe needed. Jung woke, knowing his task lay in the West. India's profound solutions couldn't be simply transplanted. Europe had to find its own path to wholeness. The Indians he met gently baffled him. They spoke of good and evil as varying degrees of the same thing. Maya, illusion, made all distinctions ultimately false. A holy man in Benares told Jung that Jesus and Satan were brothers, both sons of God. Jung's Western mind quietly recoiled. Yet he saw how this perspective allowed Indians to accept life's darkness without the tortured guilt that plagued Europeans. At the Temple of Konark, covered with erotic sculptures, Jung saw sexuality integrated into religious life. The carvings showed every possible sexual act as part of divine play. Christianity had split spirit and flesh, creating neurosis. Hinduism gently united them. But Jung noticed the Indians paid a subtle price. They seemed less individually developed, more embedded in collective traditions. The trip's most important moment came through absence. Jung deliberately avoided meeting any gurus. He didn't visit Ramana Maharshi, though they were in India at the same time. Jung knew he could easily fall under a guru's influence, lose his Western critical faculty. His path required maintaining creative tension between consciousness and the unconscious. Eastern enlightenment, he felt, dissolved that tension entirely. Returning to Europe in 1938, Jung felt confirmed in his direction. East and West, he realized, were compensatory. The East had developed the inner world while neglecting the outer. The West had mastered external reality while losing its soul. Neither path alone was complete. Individuation meant gently holding both, refusing to escape into either pure spirituality or pure materialism. Chapter 12. The Second World War and a Near-Death Vision. September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Jung had seen it gently coming in his patient's dreams for years. Images of fire, blood, cities in ruins. The collective unconscious had been quietly preparing for catastrophe. Now it arrived. Jung felt the weight of it physically. His chest tightened. Sleep became difficult. Switzerland was surrounded by fascist powers. Jung's name appeared on a Nazi blacklist after the fall of France in 1940. The Swiss authorities, knowing this, urged him to flee Zurich for the mountains. German agents operated freely in border areas. A kidnapping or assassination was possible. Jung refused to leave. He would stay with his patients, his family, his work. If the Nazis came, they came. He treated refugees who escaped across the border. Their stories were fragments of hell, camps, deportations, neighbors vanishing in the night. Jung saw the shadow archetype operating on a massive scale. Everything Europe couldn't acknowledge in itself was being projected and destroyed. The cultured Germans who read Goethe were running extermination camps. Civilization, he realized, was a thin crust over chaos. His son Franz was called up for military service. Swiss men guarded the borders while invasion seemed imminent. Emma organized the household for potential siege. Blackout curtains, food stores, plans for evacuation. Jung continued seeing patients. Many were having apocalyptic dreams. The boundaries between inner and outer catastrophe gently dissolved. Personal neurosis seemed trivial against the backdrop of collective madness. In February 1944, Jung slipped on ice outside his house. His leg broke, then his heart failed. For 3 weeks, he hovered between life and death. During this time, he had visions that changed him permanently. He found himself 1,000 miles above Earth. The planet floated below, bathed in blue light. He could see the Arabian desert, the snow-capped Himalayas, the Mediterranean, stretching toward Gibraltar. A dark stone temple appeared, floating in space. Jung knew all his questions would be answered inside. He was about to enter when his doctor appeared, in the form of the ancient Greek healer, Asclepius. The doctor brought a gentle message. Jung had to return. People needed him on Earth. Jung felt a quiet, bitter disappointment. The vision was more real than ordinary life. Returning meant resuming the whole phantasmagoria of earthly existence. For weeks after revival, Jung couldn't tolerate daylight. The world seemed like a prison, but gradually, something shifted. He began experiencing what he called the mysterium conjunctionis, the sacred marriage of opposites. Day and night, he felt bathed in eternal light. The nurse who attended him later said his room seemed to glow. He understood something beyond intellectual knowledge. The self was real, more real than the ego. Death was a transition, not an ending. When he recovered enough to work, Jung wrote differently. The urgency was gone, replaced by certainty. He had touched something beyond argument or proof. His remaining years would be spent articulating what he'd glimpsed in that space between worlds. The war ended in May 1945. Europe lay in ruins. But Jung had seen from a cosmic height that destruction and creation were parts of a larger, enduring pattern. The work of rebuilding souls, he knew, would be harder than rebuilding cities. Chapter 13. Reaping the Harvest, Asian, and Job. After his near-death experience, Jung wrote with a new, quiet freedom. He no longer tried to convince anyone. He simply recorded what he'd discovered. The first major work was Ezi, published in 1951. The book gently traced symbols of the self through 2,000 years of Christian history. Jung showed how Christ functioned as a self-symbol for Western culture, but an incomplete one. Christ represented only light, goodness, perfection. This one-sidedness, he argued, created a shadow. The figure of the Antichrist arose as a psychological necessity. What was excluded from the divine image had to manifest somehow. The Book of Revelation, he noted, showed this process: God's wrath, the destruction, the beast rising from the sea. These were Christianity's return of the repressed. The shadow of absolute goodness was absolute evil. Jung connected this to the astrological age of Pisces, the two fish swimming in opposite directions. Christianity, he suggested, had split reality into irreconcilable opposites: God and devil, spirit and flesh, good and evil. This split created Western civilization's dynamism, but also its neurosis. The approaching age of Aquarius, he mused, would gently demand the integration of opposites. Humanity would have to face its shadow, or risk destroying itself. While writing Amazon, Jung felt gently compelled towards something more personal. For decades he'd wrestled with the problem of divine darkness. His childhood vision of God gently reordering Basel Cathedral had never left him. Now in 1952, he wrote Answer to Job in a burst of passionate intensity. He wrote it, he said, in a fever, as if taking dictation from the unconscious. The book was, for some, theological dynamite. Jung argued that in the book of Job, God revealed himself as unconscious. Yahweh tortured his faithful servant to win a bet with Satan. He acted like a tyrant, demanding worship while inflicting suffering. Job maintained his integrity against divine injustice. This, Jung suggested, forced God toward consciousness. God had to become human in Christ to develop moral awareness, but the incarnation was incomplete. Christ was sinless, therefore not fully human. The crucifixion didn't redeem humanity. It was God's attempt to expiate his guilt toward Job. The real transformation Jung proposed would come through ordinary humans becoming conscious of their own divinity and darkness. Each individual who achieved consciousness gently helped God become conscious. This, he felt, was the meaning of the Holy Spirit working through humanity. The book gently scandalized theologians. Jung was accused of blasphemy, insanity, inflation. He didn't care. He'd written what had quietly tormented him since childhood. The problem of evil couldn't be solved by theological formulas. It had to be lived, suffered, integrated. Every individual who faced their own capacity for evil without being destroyed by it contributed to the transformation of the God image. These works gently exhausted Jung. He was in his 70s, feeling his mortality, but he'd said what he needed to say. The Western God image was transforming. The split between good and evil was healing, not through institutional religion, but through individuals doing inner work. Each person who integrated their shadow, who united their opposites, participated in the continuing incarnation. The work he'd begun in his confrontation with the unconscious was bearing quiet fruit for humanity. Chapter 14. The Final Conjunction. The 1950s brought losses that cut deep. Toni Wolff died suddenly in March 1953. She had been Jung's colleague, collaborator, and companion for 40 years. Her death left him physically ill for months. She had understood parts of him that no one else could reach. Her analytical gifts had shaped his thinking about psychological types. Now that particular conversation was gently over. 2 years later came the harder blow. Emma fell ill in 1955. The diagnosis was cancer. She'd been his anchor for 52 years, raising their 5 children while he descended into the unconscious. She'd learned his psychology from inside, becoming an analyst herself. Her work on the Grail legend would be published posthumously. On November 27th, she died. Jung called it the worst loss of his life. He channeled his grief into stone. At Bollingen, he carved tablets with the names of his ancestors, his paternal line, his maternal line, reaching back centuries. The work connected him to what he called the impersonal karma within a family. Individual life was brief, but the ancestral stream flowed gently on. He was one momentary form taken by an eternal process. Despite the losses, Jung completed his opus magnum, Mysterium Conjunctionis, in 1955. The book explored alchemical symbolism of the union of opposites for 700 pages. He traced how alchemists projected psychological processes onto chemical operations. When they described sulfur and mercury combining to create the philosopher's stone, they were really describing consciousness uniting with the unconscious to create wholeness. The alchemists, he discovered, knew something Christianity had gently forgotten. Transformation required darkness. The prima materia, the starting point of the work, was found in filth, in what was rejected. You had to descend into the shadow, integrate what you denied, before ascending to consciousness. The philosopher's stone wasn't perfection, but completeness. It included everything, light and dark, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter. Jung's late essays turned toward humanity's future. The Undiscovered Self, published in 1957, warned against mass-mindedness. Television advertising, political propaganda were creating psychological conformity. Individuals were disappearing into statistical averages. The only defense against collective possession, he argued, was self-knowledge. Each person who knew their own shadow couldn't be manipulated by demagogues. Flying saucers fascinated him, not as extraterrestrial vehicles, but as projections. Modern humanity, having lost religious symbols, projected the self onto technological imagery. The round, glowing discs coming from above, bringing superior beings, these were technological mandalas, desperate, quiet attempts by the psyche to represent wholeness in an age that had forgotten the sacred. By 1960, Jung was 85. His body was gently failing, but his mind remained sharp. He gave his last interview to the BBC. When asked if he believed in God, he paused. Then he said he didn't need to believe. He knew. This wasn't faith, but empirical observation. He'd experienced the reality of the psyche, its objective existence beyond personal consciousness. Whether you called it God or self or collective unconscious didn't matter. The quiet reality remained. Chapter 15. Back to the rhizome. In 1960, Jung had a dream that would quietly determine his final act. He stood in a vast public space, addressing a multitude who deeply understood him. For decades, His ideas had lived in analytical journals and specialized books. But this dream suggested something different. The collective unconscious was preparing to receive what he'd discovered. When BBC producer John Freeman approached him about writing a popular book explaining his psychology, Jung initially refused. Then the dream returned, more insistent. He called Freeman back. The project became Man and His Symbols, Jung's gentle attempt to speak directly to ordinary people about the reality of the psyche. He chose his collaborators carefully, each one someone who'd internalized his ideas through years of personal work. As he wrote through 1961, his body failing but mind still sharp, Jung knew this was his testament. 10 days before his death, he finished his chapter. The timing felt orchestrated by the same forces he'd studied for 60 years. Those final weeks brought visions of extraordinary beauty. He dreamed of a great round stone, inscribed with words about wholeness and oneness, then of trees whose roots were golden threads, rising from the earth to surround him with light. He'd often compared human life to a plant living on its rhizome, the visible part lasting one summer while the root quietly remains. On June 6, 1961, Carl Jung died peacefully at Kusnach, his particular flowering complete, the essential pattern returning to the eternal substrate from which new growth would gently emerge. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jung's closest collaborators. His ideas, which had been confined to analytical circles, began spreading through culture like water finding its level. Joseph Campbell had already begun translating Jung's insights about myth into language artists and writers could use. The Hero with 1,000 Faces showed how every culture's stories followed the same archetypal pattern Jung had identified. The hero venturing into darkness to bring back treasure for the community. This wasn't just literary analysis, but a map of psychological transformation that George Lucas would use to structure Star Wars, introducing millions to Jungian psychology without them even knowing it. The therapeutic community discovered that Jung had mapped territories Freud never entered. Where Freud explained neurosis through personal history, Jung offered a larger story that included meaning, purpose, and spiritual development. Alcoholics Anonymous had already incorporated Jung's insight that addiction was spiritual thirst misdirected, building their 12-step program on essentially Jungian principles. The surrender to a higher power was acknowledgement of forces beyond ego control. Making amends was shadow integration. The program worked because it was individuation in disguise, transformation presented in language alcoholics could gently accept. The 60s counterculture found in Jung what they couldn't find in Freud or behaviorism, a psychology that honored direct experience over institutional authority. While academic psychology insisted consciousness could be reduced to stimulus and response, Jung had demonstrated that the psyche contained depths that couldn't be measured or controlled. The human potential movement at Esalen built directly on Jungian foundations. The idea that each person contained vast untapped potential waiting for actualization came straight from Jung's concept of individuation. Women particularly responded to Jung's refusal to define feminine psychology through lack or deficiency. His concept of the anima gave men permission to acknowledge their feminine aspects without shame, while his concept of the animus helped women claim their masculine power without apology. Marian Woodman would develop this into a psychology of the feminine body, showing how women's symptoms often expressed unlived life. Clarissa Pinkola Estes would use Jungian analysis to decode fairy tales as maps of feminine individuation, her Women Who Run with the Wolves reaching millions who'd never heard of Jung but recognized their own experience in his archetypal patterns. The hard sciences began confirming what Jung had discovered through introspection. Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist who'd been Jung's patient and collaborator, had already shown that quantum mechanics suggested a reality more like Jung's synchronicity than Newton's clockwork universe. Consciousness seemed to affect matter at the quantum level, suggesting psyche and physics were aspects of one reality. Neuroscience would later discover that mythological symbols activated ancient brain structures, that the archetypes might be hardwired patterns evolved over millennia of human experience. But Jung's most profound legacy was the transformation of how Western culture understood evil. Before Jung, evil was either sin requiring punishment or sickness requiring cure. Jung showed it was shadow, the rejected aspects of personality that got projected onto others. This psychological understanding offered hope where theology and medicine offered only management. If evil was projection, it could be withdrawn. If enemies carried our shadows, we could reclaim those projections and gently end the cycle of hatred. This insight would become crucial as humanity developed weapons capable of global destruction while still operating from a tribal psychology. Today, Jung's language has entered everyday speech so thoroughly we often forget its origin. People talk about complexes, introverts and extroverts, shadows and personas, without knowing these were Jung's discoveries. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, based on Jung's psychological types, helps millions understand that different doesn't mean deficient. Dream work, active imagination, and sound play therapy offer gentle ways to access unconscious wisdom. The idea that symptoms have meaning, that crisis can be transformation, that the second half of life has different tasks than the first, all come from Jung. The rhizome Jung returned to in death gently continues, producing new growth. His ideas flowering in fields he never imagined, from ecology to artificial intelligence, from religious studies to pop culture. Each generation discovers in Jung what it needs for its particular crisis. His core insight remains constant. The psyche is real. It has purpose beyond personal pleasure, and conscious relationship with it is the great work of human life. Jung didn't found a school or create a dogma. He opened a door and said, "Look for yourself." Millions have, and continue to look, finding in their own depths what Jung found in his. The pool of life he glimpsed in that Liverpool dream keeps reflecting new light as humanity continues its long, quiet journey toward consciousness. Now, as our story comes to a close, may the echoes of Jung's profound exploration softly guide you into a restful and peaceful sleep. Allow your own inner world to gently unfold, knowing that within you lies an endless source of wisdom and calm. Good night, dear listener. Rest well.